You did a linguistic analysis with the Bible and the Quran.
Yeah.
Is there a place where we can look at that work?
Yeah, totally. It's on our portfolio. Or if you just Google Bible versus Quran by pitch, you'll see it. It's there. It's interesting. It's not this in-depth tool where you can take stemmers and different words, but here's what it does. I wish I could show it, but it didn't have time, so the element of time. But you can do a search word, and it looks for synonyms of that word. You can read the entire verses of the Bible, Old and New, and the Quran in one screen. So each little squares, like with the drones piece, and they represent a verse. So you can actually read it in context. And it's interesting. It's not making decisions. It's literally like, oh, you want to see terror? Well, this is where it's definitely mentioned in the Quran and definitely mentioned in the Bible too. Or if you want to look up other elements like forgiveness or love or hate, or I mean, it was our way of like teaching ourselves. And when I showed it in Lebanon, there was a lot of like discussion there too, because a lot of people in my group were Muslim, and so we were they were curious about the Bible, and I was like, great. I grew up in a Baptist church. So it was interesting to have this sort of discourse and dialogue with people.
And Audrey, I have a question about how do you do the decision to choose the project? Like you do this drone strike because it's hit news and everybody is just concentrated on terrorism. But other project, how do you do decisions? Like it's the thing I want to do these days.
The personal projects are hard. It's easy to do the client ones because like Facebook will come to us or somebody will come to us. But we typically do have like a formula in deciding what projects. Is it challenging? Is there a good relationship that we can have with the client? Is it challenging from a technical and or creative? Does it make financial sense? It's not cheap living in Oakland and running a studio. But our personal projects, we don't get paid a dime for. Like it's on our own dime. So we really have to do it carefully. And it doesn't always work out. Like we were trying to show, our last project we were attempting to do and we had to backburn it was on incarceration. Because basically in this country, more than half of our prisons are privately owned. And if you're black and you grow up in a poor neighborhood and you're incarcerated by 18, the chances are the rest of your life is going to be in prison. And there's a really big problem with that. And usually you're in prison for drugs or something, and there's this whole history of like how drugs became illegal in certain sections, targeting certain races and certain groups, like crack cocaine versus regular. Like crack cocaine, you get 20 years in prison, which is a black drug, and then regular is like you get a year and a half and a slap on the wrist. It's interesting how there's like a lot of profiling with that, but we couldn't find data with that. Like we really wanted to show it, but without data, we can't do our work. And just improvising, that leaves so much room for people to attack it, or this is inaccurate. And we really like our work to be statistically sound, so that if and when people come in and try to attack it and say, oh, you're wrong here, why don't you show with the drones, why don't you show how many US soldiers were killed? I'm like, well, that's easy, 0. So there's no comparison because we have not lost any US soldiers in Pakistan. And Afghanistan and Iraq, those are totally different regions as well. But obviously they're connected, but the data set we're using is not. So it's really hard. And I think our next project that we're really looking at, we're actually looking at doing a mural in Oakland to show, like, we have US Census data in Oakland because Oakland's got a super rich history where you see this like growth spurt, and then in the 60s, this like white flight happened. And then like Black Panthers and all this and then suddenly Oakland became this danger town, and now it's sort of like revitalizing itself again. And there's this really interesting history in Oakland, and the more that I go back into it, the more I'm interested in that. And I'd love to do a mural depicting that. And like literally like a stream graph, like the 3-in-1 calls for New York, but showing like racial differences or average age groups or average incomes and how that's all sort of changed in Oakland, that ebb and flow. Every city's got their own, but I think Oakland's got a really special history for that. So if anyone wants to help us with a mural, find a space or something, that'd be great.
Hi, Wesley. My name is Sebastian. Thank you for your presentation. One of the things that I really always struggle with infographics is, going between if you have an experience that you gain in working with this understanding, this sort of macro-sociological understanding of seeing big patches of time in history, and what is sort of like one of the main things that you have learned in doing this type of work?
That's a really good question. I don't know how to answer it so easily. I mean, I think that there's a lot of intuition, there's a lot of experience. I mean, we've been doing data viz for almost a decade. And I've always been interested in drawing these connections. Like I said, like my undergraduate degree is in international economics. How I came to this, I have no idea. But what really fascinated me early on in economics was my professor walked into the classroom and he said, what's the #1 indicator that the CAA will use to predict the amount of heroin in New York next year? And the answer is the price of bread in Afghanistan. And that just blew my mind. Like, how can the price of bread in Afghanistan help us predict heroin? And it's really simple. Afghanistan controls 92% of the world's opiates. They hardly grow anything. They pretty much grow like poppy and wheat, and in the northern province, some nuts and berries, but that's like very little. And so if I'm a farmer, I have a plot of land and I'm gonna grow poppy seeds or wheat. And if one year I decide to grow more poppy because it's more profitable, I'm growing less wheat. So if there's less wheat on the market, we all need bread. What happens to the price is the price jumps. And when the price of bread jumps, then we know that there's an increase in poppy production. And it's interesting, like that is the kind of thing that really kind of, it fascinates me. And I'm always trying to find, how do you understand the world in those sort of veins? And especially in things that I find disturbing or I don't understand, I find myself even more curious in trying to understand. Especially with like the political situation in this country. Like how dangerous that we're getting into right now. Taking things that we don't understand and pushing them away and saying, oh, that's just evil, that's just bad, I'm better. You know, that's just, for me, that just leaves a lot of room for dangerous kind of things to happen. And my goal is to, I guess, combat that.
I'm really curious about the McKnight visualization because you're trying to compare people who have 3 years of experience as artists versus someone who has a 26-page resume.
Yeah.
And put it on axes that are meaningful for both and make it look good for both. Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Yes, that process is something we do in every project as well with time. Too bad this talk is not about normalization. We normalize it, and normalizing is basically a statistical way of taking something inside of a spectrum and translating it to something in another side of the spectrum. It's kind of complicated, but I can probably give like a week-long workshop on it. One really simple example is like if you go to our website, it'll say like current temperature in Oakland, and then the color changes. And if you look at our site, like in the morning versus the evening, the color spectrum on our site is different. And what we have is we have this like color palette, and we map it to the current temperature in Oakland. And that temperature is based off of the minimum temperature in Oakland and the maximum temperature that it could be. And then it's mapped there, but it's temperature. So it's like, how do you translate one thing into another? And two of the annotations I had, one of them was an artist that had like 1 teaching experience and 2 performances. And the next artist had like 12 performances. And it's part of mapping something on this sort of spectrum. So it's basically, I don't want to say it's complicated, but it's because it's really not. But it merits a bigger discussion. But it's called normalization, if you wanted to look that up. It's a really valuable technique in statistics, and it's basically, that's the meat of our work, is we normalize everything. How do you translate it? And you can normalize things to position, to color, to size, to scale, which size is scale, but you know, to give some sort of subjective value. I mean, you can really map it. And as long as there's a spectrum of something, you can map something between one spectrum into something to another.
With the complex type of data that you're trying to visualize, it's, I'm sure, not easy to figure out the one that tells the story best. What is it like? Like, how many dead ends do you guys go down before you'll find a good solution?
Many. I think that by design, the creative process is inefficient. And it's really like a lot of our clients, they might be technology based, and it's explaining that to them over and over. Creativity is inefficient. You're going to start with the process, and you're going to hit a dead end, and you've got to back up and go somewhere else. And I think we've trained ourselves really well to know when to let go. But that's a really difficult thing. It's taken us many the creative stuff, the ideas we show you early on are not going to be the ideas that we deliver at the end, because there's going to be so many things that we're going to learn in this process. And we intentionally want to take some rabbit holes and go in some dead ends, because that helps us sort of exhaust ideas. And the talk I gave in New Zealand, it was interesting because it was all about happiness and creativity and how we need to have balanced lives and be happy, because when we're happy, we're curious and we want to explore. And exploring helps us generate more ideas. even though there might be more dead ends, but there are more ideas to explore with. And it's really important to have this like this personal and work-life balance really well, because that helps you really be open to new ideas and new explorations and all that.